We only kept you for the tax benefits, and frankly, we've done our part. My mother, Bella, said those words with a perfectly practiced, closed-mouth smile. We were sitting at a corner booth in Maggie's Place, the busiest restaurant in our small, tight-knit town, right in the middle of the Friday night dinner rush. The air smelled of fried chicken, cedarwood, and spilled beer. A country song was playing softly through the ceiling speakers, but at our table, the silence was deafening. She said it loudly enough for the couple at the next table to hear. In fact, she shifted her weight and pitched her voice specifically so the pastor's wife, sitting 3 booths down, could catch the tail end of her martyrdom. Sabella always needed an audience. 6 words. That's all it took for her to try and demolish 25 years of everything I thought I knew about my place in the world. But here's the part Sabella didn't know. Here's the secret that was resting heavily in my lap, hidden beneath the edge of the checkered tablecloth. I had been preparing for this exact moment for 8 long, agonizing months, and the people sitting quietly 3 tables behind her, the ones pretending to look at their menus, they weren't strangers. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't shrink down in my chair the way she fully expected me to. Instead, I reached into my leather bag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and watched the immaculate, perfectly curated life Sabella had built for decades shatter into a million unfixable pieces. But to understand how we got to that table and why that envelope was the heaviest thing I've ever carried, you need to hear the whole story. I'm Isabeau. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. Let me take you back to the beginning of the end. 8 months before that birthday dinner, the very first month of autumn, when the leaves were just starting to turn the color of rusted iron. For the past 3 years, I had been living in a converted garage apartment behind my parents' house. It was a drafty, single-room box with water-stained drywall and a window that looked directly out onto Sabella's prized rose garden, a garden she planted exclusively for the neighborhood association to admire, but never allowed anyone to actually cut flowers from. I paid $400 a month in rent to live in that garage. I was a licensed veterinary technician, working 50-hour weeks at a local 2-doctor clinic, spending my days covered in dog hair, sanitizer, and exhaustion. I paid my own car insurance, my own health insurance, and the student loans I had to take out to get through community college. Yet, Sabella loved to remind me, and anyone else who would listen, what a profound act of charity my living arrangement was. "We just want to give her a soft place to land," she would tell the women at the post office, resting a manicured hand over her chest, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Adoption is a lifelong commitment, you know. You never really stop sacrificing for them, even when they struggle to launch." Struggle to launch. That was her favorite phrase. It painted her as the endlessly patient savior and me as the burdensome, ungrateful charity case. Sabella was a master of the performative sacrifice. Everything she did came with a receipt, an expectation, and an invisible string that she could yank whenever she felt I was getting too independent. My father, Benedetto, was the silent partner in her one-woman show. If Sabella was the storm, Benedetto was the boarded-up window. He never tried to stop the destruction. He just tried to stay out of the way. He was a man composed entirely of heavy sighs, newspaper reading, and averted gazes. He agreed with whatever Sabella said just to keep the peace in his own house, trading my emotional well-being for his own quiet evenings. It was a crisp Tuesday evening when the first domino fell. I had just finished a grueling shift at the clinic. I walked up the cracked concrete driveway, my boots heavy, and found a neon yellow sticky note plastered to the door of my garage apartment. It was written in Sabella's sharp, aggressive cursive. No greeting. No "Hi, honey," just a command. "Basement Saturday. Harper needs space. Don't forget." Harper is Sabella's biological niece. She's 23, perpetually between jobs, and was moving back to our town after yet another messy, dramatic breakup. Apparently, Sabella and Benedetto had offered Harper the beautiful, sunlit spare bedroom in the main house, the room that used to be mine before Sabella suggested I move to the garage to learn responsibility. But Harper had a lot of things, and they needed the basement spotless to store her endless boxes of clothes and furniture. Sabella didn't ask if I was free. She didn't ask if I wanted to spend my only day off inhaling 20 years of accumulated basement dust. She demanded it, because in the Hayes family economy, I was the one who was forever in their debt. So, that Saturday morning, Armed with a thermos of black coffee and a roll of heavy-duty trash bags, I walked across the frost-covered lawn and descended the wooden stairs into the basement. It smelled like damp concrete, old cedar, and forgotten time. The lighting was dim, casting long, eerie shadows across towers of cardboard boxes. For 3 solid hours, I sorted through the graveyard of my childhood and their marriage. I dragged heavy boxes across the floor, sneezing through the dust. I found broken holiday decorations, Benedito's rusted golf clubs from a hobby he abandoned a decade ago, and crates of cheap porcelain figurines Sabella used to collect. It was mindless, exhausting work designed to make me feel small. Around noon, my lower back was aching. I was dragging a massive plastic bin of old winter coats away from the back wall when I noticed something pushed deep into the crawl space. It was wedged tightly behind the bulky metal cylinder of the water heater, hidden from plain sight. A smaller, opaque plastic storage box. It was covered in a thick, greasy layer of dust, suggesting it hadn't been moved in years. It was sealed tight with heavy packing tape that had begun to yellow and peel at the edges. Across the top lid, written in thick, faded black marker, was a single word: private. In any normal, healthy family, private means old love letters or maybe embarrassing medical records. You respect the boundary, you leave it alone. But I didn't grow up in a healthy family. I grew up in a house built on secrets and image control. In Sabella's world, private usually meant something she was hiding to maintain her perfect facade. I knelt on the cold concrete. I stared at the box. My heart started to beat a little faster, a strange, instinctual thrumming in my ears. I knew I shouldn't open it. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to push it back behind the water heater and walk away. But my hands were already moving. I pulled my box cutter from my back pocket. The blade made a sharp, tearing sound as it sliced through the brittle tape. I pried the plastic lid off. A cloud of stale air puffed up into my face. Inside, there weren't love letters. There were no photo albums. There was just a single, thick manila envelope wrapped shut with a red string. I sat back on my heels, the cold seeping through my jeans, and carefully unwound the string. What I pulled out of that envelope didn't just break my heart. It fundamentally rewired my entire understanding of who I was and who the people upstairs truly were. The very first document was an official adoption certificate. It had the raised seal of the county clerk. I had seen copies of this before, but tucked right behind it was something I had never been allowed to see: my original, unaltered birth certificate. I ran my thumb over the thick paper. In the center, under name of child, it didn't have a name. It simply said, baby girl, no father listed. And next to the mother's name, a signature that looked shaky, written by someone whose hand was trembling. Beneath those 2 documents was a faded receipt from a regional tax preparation firm dated the exact year I was adopted. A single line item was highlighted in aggressive neon yellow marker. Adoption tax credit, $5,400. I felt a slight, sickening twist in my gut, but I tried to rationalize it. People take tax credits. That's normal. It's clinical, it lacks warmth, but it's not inherently malicious. Sabella had always been obsessed with money. But it was the 3rd stack of papers that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was a thick legal packet, perhaps 40 pages long, bound with a heavy brass staple. The header at the top of the first page was printed in bold, uncompromising font: The Hayes Family Revocable Living Trust. I knew Benedetto's parents, my adoptive grandparents, had been wealthy. They were old money traditionalists who passed away when I was very young. I only remembered a stern house smelling of lemon polish and peppermints. I started reading the dense legal jargon. I am not a lawyer, but I am not stupid. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, tracing lines of text that seemed to blur together until I hit a specific, devastating clause. My grandparents had explicitly stipulated that a massive portion of their estate was to be locked in a trust. But there was a catch. They disapproved of Sabella's lavish spending habits and Benedito's weak spine. So, the trust was entirely inaccessible to them. It was reserved exclusively for the care, upbringing, and educational expenses of a legal grandchild. And Benedito and Sabella couldn't have biological children. I flipped to the next page, my hands beginning to shake violently. Attached to the back of the trust document was a ledger, a meticulously printed bank record of withdrawals spanning 25 years. Every single withdrawal was countersigned by Sabella, listed under her title as the custodial trustee. I read the lines. The betrayal was so precise it felt physical. Withdrawal $18,000. Stated reason: advanced medical and living expenses for minor child. I looked at the date. It was the exact year Sabella miraculously bought her brand new, fully loaded luxury SUV, while I was wearing hand-me-down clothes from the thrift store. Withdrawal: $25,000. Stated reason: educational enhancement and housing expansion for minor child. That was the year Benedetto mysteriously paid off his crippling credit card debt, and they remodeled the kitchen with imported Italian marble. I didn't get a housing expansion. I got moved to the garage a few years later. Line by line, page by page, the truth bled out in black ink. They hadn't just adopted me to get a one-time tax break. They adopted me to act as the physical key to unlock Benedetto's parents' fortune. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a prop. I was a living, breathing, legal loophole. I sat alone on that basement floor for what felt like hours. The silence of the house pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I could hear Benedetto's footsteps moving across the hardwood floor right above my head, oblivious to the fact that his foundation was crumbling beneath him. I didn't cry. The betrayal was too deep, too chillingly calculated for tears. Crying is for when your feelings get hurt. This wasn't hurt. This was an assassination of my entire reality. It felt like someone had reached into my chest, grabbed my ribs, and pulled them wide open, letting the freezing cold air rush into spaces that were supposed to be safe. Every memory I had was suddenly poisoned by this new, horrifying context. Every time Sabella told me how expensive I was to raise, making me feel like a burden for eating the food in her fridge. Every time Benedetto looked away when I asked for a little help paying for my community college textbooks. I had worked double shifts at a diner to pay for those classes, coming home smelling of grease and bleach while they legally drained my educational fund to finance their lifestyle. They had stolen my childhood, they had stolen my financial security, and they had wrapped it all up in the bow of a loving adoption, demanding my absolute gratitude every step of the way. But the final page of the trust document was the most important. It was the ticking clock, the reason I was still living in their garage. Clause 7. Upon the beneficiary reaching the age of 25 years, the trust shall reach full maturity. The beneficiary may claim the remaining principal and request a full forensic audit of all past custodial withdrawals. Alternatively, the custodial trustees must secure a signed liability waiver and financial release from the beneficiary to legally dissolve the trust and close the accounts without penalty. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood. I was turning 25 in exactly 8 months. If I turned 25 and asked to see the trust, I could legally audit them. I could expose the 25 years of fraud. I could ruin them. They needed me to sign a piece of paper waiving my rights to a fund I never even knew existed. They needed me compliant, dependent, and utterly unaware. That was why Sabella kept me close. That was why she charged me just enough rent to keep me poor, but not enough to force me to move away. They were managing me. I was livestock being kept in a pen until slaughter day, my 25th birthday. I carefully folded the papers. My hands were no longer shaking. They were steady, ice cold, but steady. I slid the documents back into the manila envelope, wrapped the red string, and placed it exactly where I found it in the plastic bin. I pressed the old tape down, rubbing the dust over the seams so it looked completely untouched. I slid the bin back behind the water heater. When I walked up those wooden stairs and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, I was not the same woman who had walked down them. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my best friend, Chloe. Chloe and I had worked together at the vet clinic for 4 years. She was fiercely loyal, incredibly grounded, and the only person in this town who saw through Sabella's fake smiles. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright over the background noise of barking dogs. "Hey, did you survive the basement of doom?" she joked. "Did you find Jimmy Hoffa down there?" "Chloe," I said. My voice sounded hollow, metallic, like it was coming from someone else. "I need you to meet me." "Are you okay? You sound weird." "Not at the house. The gravel parking lot behind the clinic. 10 minutes, please." "I'm on my way," she said, her tone instantly shifting from playful to dead serious. I drove to the clinic in complete silence. The town looked different through my windshield. The quaint brick storefronts, the pristine white church where Sabella played her holy role so perfectly, the bakery where we bought my birthday cakes, it all looked like a movie set built entirely on a lie. Everyone in this town thought my parents were saints. Chloe was waiting in the freezing cold, her arms wrapped tightly around her blue scrubs. I pulled my beat-up sedan into the lot, unlocked the passenger door, and she slid in, bringing a rush of cold air with her. I didn't say a word. I just gripped the steering wheel and stared straight ahead at the tree line. "Isabeau," Chloe said softly, reaching out to touch my arm. "Talk to me. You're white as a sheet. Remember that Ancestry DNA kit you bought me for Christmas 2 years ago?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The one I shoved in the back of my bathroom drawer because I told you I didn't need it? Because I already knew who my family was?" "Yeah," she said slowly. "I remember." I turned to look at her. "I need to use it. Tonight." Chloe studied my face. She didn't ask me why I was shaking. She didn't ask me what terrible thing I had found in the dark of that basement. She just saw the absolute wreckage in my eyes and nodded. "Okay," she said firmly. "We'll do it tonight." "What else?" "I'm going to need a lawyer," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "A quiet one. Someone outside of this town who deals with financial fraud and trusts." Chloe's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't push for details. That was why I loved her. "I know a guy in the city," she said. "My brother used him for a business dispute. He's a shark. I'll get you his number." That night, sitting on the edge of my bathtub in the garage apartment, the only sound was the dripping of the leaky faucet. I tore the plastic wrap off the DNA kit. I swabbed the inside of my cheek, staring at my own reflection in the mirror. I looked the same, but the girl looking back at me was a stranger. I sealed the vial in the return box. At midnight, when the main house was completely dark, I slipped out into the cold and drove to the post office. I dropped the little white box into the metal slot. It made a hollow thud as it hit the bottom. 6 weeks for results. That's what the packaging said. I had to live with Sibella and Benedetto for 6 weeks, pretending I didn't know that my entire existence in their home was a calculated financial extraction. I had to smile when Sibella brought over a leftover casserole, acting like a martyr who was feeding the poor. I had to say, "Thank you, Dad," when Benedetto offered to check the oil in my car. I had 8 months until my 25th birthday. 8 months until the trap they had spent decades building finally snapped shut. Sibella and Benedetto thought they had all the leverage. They had the property, the hidden documents, the money, and the flawless facade of the perfect, loving adoptive parents. They thought I was a naive, grateful little girl who would blindly sign whatever paper they slid across a table. But leverage only works when the victim is blind. My eyes were finally wide open, and I had 8 months to build a trap of my own. Winter arrived in our small town not with a gentle snowfall, but with a bitter, bone-chilling wind that stripped the trees bare and turned the sky the color of bruised slate. Living in that uninsulated garage apartment became a daily test of endurance. But the cold seeping through the cheap drywall was nothing compared to the ice in my veins every time I had to cross the yard and step into the main house. For 6 weeks, I lived a double life. I was a ghost haunting my own existence. Every Sunday, Sibella insisted on family dinner. It was a mandatory performance. I would sit at the polished mahogany dining table, passing the roast beef, listening to her complain about the cost of groceries, the cost of the electric bill, the cost of me. "Harper is finally settled into the spare room," Sibella announced one Sunday evening, elegantly slicing her meat. Harper had moved in 2 weeks prior, bringing with her a cloud of expensive perfume and a profound sense of entitlement. It's been an adjustment, of course. She's used to finer things, but Benedetto and I are happy to help family. She emphasized the word family, letting it hang in the air like a delicate glass ornament, waiting to see if I would bump into it. "She's very lucky to have you," I said smoothly, taking a sip of water. My voice didn't waver. I was getting frighteningly good at this. "Well, we've always been generous to a fault," Sibella sighed, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. She leveled her gaze at me. "Which reminds me, you'll need to pitch in a bit more for the utilities this winter. The garage heater draws so much power. An extra $50 a month should cover it. It's only fair, considering how much we subsidized your schooling." I looked at Benedetto. He was aggressively focused on his mashed potatoes, chewing with the methodical rhythm of a man desperate to be invisible. Subsidized my schooling. The words echoed in my head. I thought of the ledger in the basement. The $25,000 they had withdrawn from my trust fund under the guise of educational enhancement right around the time Sibella ripped out the perfectly good kitchen counters to install imported marble. "Of course," I smiled, a thin, perfectly polite smile. "I'll add it to the rent check." "You're a good girl," Sibella purred, satisfied that she had extracted her tiny tribute for the week. She thought she was training me. grooming me for the final submission on my 25th birthday. But every slight, every lie, every passive-aggressive demand for gratitude was just another brick I was quietly adding to the wall I was going to drop on her head. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a brutal blizzard. I was at the clinic, hiding in the break room with my hands wrapped around a paper cup of stale coffee. The dogs in the back wards were finally quiet. I pulled out my phone, mindlessly refreshing my inbox, when the notification slid across the screen. Ancestry. Close family match found. The paper cup slipped from my hands, splashing lukewarm coffee across the linoleum floor. I didn't even grab a paper towel. My thumbs were shaking so badly I could barely type my password to log in. The screen loaded agonizingly slowly, the little circle spinning, mocking my racing heart. And then, there it was. Match, Clara Miller. Relationship, parent. Confidence, 99.9%. I stopped breathing. I stared at the tiny profile picture next to the name. It was a woman in her early 40s standing on a wooden porch with her arms crossed over a thick wool sweater. She had the exact same wave in her dark hair that I spent 20 minutes flat ironing every morning. She had the same sharp slope of her jawline. She lived in a town about 2.5 hours north. For 25 years, Sabella had painted a very specific picture of my origins. Whenever I asked about my biological mother, Sabella would lower her voice to a theatrical whisper and shake her head. She was a troubled girl. Addiction. She couldn't take care of herself, let alone a baby. We saved you from a terrible life in the system. You were unwanted. I looked at the picture of Clara Miller. She didn't look like a tragic cautionary tale. She looked like a middle school art teacher. She looked normal. I drafted the message 4 times. The first 3 were too emotional, too desperate, too angry. The 4th was painfully simple. Dear Clara, my name is Isabeau. I believe I am your biological daughter. I was born in November 25 years ago. I am not looking for money or a kidney. I just want to know where I came from. If you are open to it, I would love to talk. I hit send before my courage collapsed. I didn't sleep that night. I laid in the freezing dark of the garage, watching the shadows of the barren rose bushes scrape against my window pane. I waited for a miracle. What I got was a nightmare. The reply came the next morning, just as I was unlocking the front doors of the clinic. It was a single, devastating paragraph. Isabeau, you have the wrong person. I don't know who you are, but I do not have a 25-year-old daughter. Please respect my privacy and do not contact me again, or I will report the harassment. I read it standing in the icy parking lot, the wind whipping my hair across my face. You have the wrong person. It was a physical blow. The DNA didn't lie, which meant she was lying. She was terrified. She was rejecting me all over again. Sabella's venomous little voice echoed in my head. You were unwanted. Maybe Sabella had been a monster for stealing my trust fund, but maybe she had been right about my mother. Chloe found me sitting on the floor behind the reception desk, my knees pulled to my chest, staring blankly at the wall. She read the email over my shoulder. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say, maybe she just needs time. Chloe just sat down on the cold floor next to me, pulled my head onto her shoulder, and let me cry until my ribs ached. Well, I whispered, wiping my face with the back of my sleeve. At least now I know. I have no one. Just me and a lawyer I can't afford yet. You have me, Chloe said fiercely, and you have a plan. Don't let this derail you. Sabella wants you broken. Don't do her the favor of breaking before the finish line. 3 days passed. The blizzard cleared, leaving the town buried under 2 feet of snow. I threw myself into my work, burying my grief in the routine of drawing blood, soothing nervous golden retrievers, and scrubbing cages. On Friday afternoon, the little bell above the clinic door jingled. I was at the front desk typing up a chart. Welcome to Oak Creek Vet. I'll be right with... I looked up. Standing in the lobby, shivering in a thin trench coat that was entirely inappropriate for the winter weather, was the woman from the photograph, Clara Miller. She looked entirely different in person. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, as if she hadn't slept in a week. She was clutching her purse with white-knuckled intensity. She looked at me, and I saw my own eyes looking back. The lobby was empty. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Isabeau? She whispered. Her voice broke on the syllables of my name. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. You said I had the wrong person. Clara let out a ragged sob and covered her mouth with both hands. I'm sorry, she gasped, the tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her makeup. I am so sorry. I panicked, and I lied. I stepped out from behind the counter, locking the front door and flipping the open sign to closed. I guided her into empty exam room 2. It smelled of rubbing alcohol and wet fur, but it was private. She sat on the metal bench, trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. I pulled a clean fleece blanket from the supply closet and draped it over her shoulders. I didn't touch her beyond that. I didn't know how. "Why did you lie?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my hands were shaking in my pockets. "If you didn't want me, you could have just ignored the message." "I have wanted you," Clara sobbed, looking up at me with profound, agonizing grief, "every single day for 25 years. And then she told me the truth. A truth that Sabella had buried under decades of convenient, self-serving lies. Clara hadn't been an addict. She hadn't thrown me away. She had been 17 years old, terrified and pregnant in a deeply religious, unforgiving household. When her parents found out, they locked her in her room. They arranged the private adoption with a wealthy, respectable family, the Hayes family, without her consent. "They told me I was going to ruin your life," Clara wept, clutching the edges of the fleece blanket. "My father brought the paperwork into my bedroom 2 days after you were born. I was still bleeding. I was so scared. He stood over me and told me if I didn't sign, he would throw me out onto the street and you would go into the foster system and be abused. He told me the Hayes family could give you the world." She looked at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. "When I saw your email, it triggered every nightmare I've had since I was 17. The shame, the terror. My husband, Thomas, he didn't even know. Nobody knew. I buried it because the pain of it was going to kill me. I replied to you in a blind panic, and then I spent 3 days sitting on my bathroom floor, throwing up, hating myself for failing you a second time." I leaned against the stainless steel sink, absorbing the weight of her words. Sabella had bought me. She had leveraged a terrified teenager's trauma to secure her own financial future. "You didn't fail me," I said quietly. Clara looked up, her breath hitching. "You survived," I told her, "and so did I." That afternoon, I called out of the rest of my shift. I made Clara tea in the break room. She told me about Thomas, the man she married 5 years after she lost me, a quiet, sturdy mechanic who grounded her. She told me about Wyatt, her 20-year-old son, my brother. "I told them everything last night," Clara said, staring into her teacup. "Thomas just held me. Wyatt is angry. He's protective. He hates that I've been hurting for so long and he didn't know. They want to meet you." 2 weeks later, on a freezing Sunday morning, I lied to Sabella. I told her I was covering an emergency shift at the clinic. Instead, I drove 2.5 hours north, past the snow-covered pine forest, to a modest, slightly weathered farmhouse at the end of a gravel road. This was the part of the story where, in a movie, everyone runs into each other's arms, the music swells, and all the trauma is instantly healed by the magic of blood. But reality is much messier than a movie script. When I knocked on the front door, my stomach was in knots. The door swung open to reveal Thomas Miller. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with grease permanently stained into the calluses of his hands and kind, tired eyes. He didn't hug me. He wiped his hand on his jeans, extended it, and gave me a firm, awkward handshake. "Isabeau, come on in. It's freezing." The house was cluttered, warm, and smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon. It was the exact opposite of Sabella's sterile, museum-like mansion. Clara hovered in the kitchen, nervously twisting a dish towel, overjoyed but clearly terrified of doing something wrong. But it was the boy leaning against the doorframe of the living room who sucked the air out of the room. Wyatt. He was 20, tall and gangly, with Clara's dark hair and a jawline set in pure granite. He was staring at me with a mixture of intense curiosity and blatant hostility. Dinner was agonizing. Thomas had grilled steaks in the dead of winter standing on the snowy porch because he didn't know what else to do to show hospitality. The clinking of forks against plates sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. "So," Wyatt said suddenly, breaking a 10-minute silence. He pointed his fork at me. "You're a vet tech. That's cool. Do you live with your adoptive parents?" "Wyatt, please," Clara whispered, her eyes darting between us. "What?" "I'm just asking," Wyatt retorted, his tone defensive. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "It's just wild, you know. She's been crying herself to sleep on your birthday every year for 2 decades, and you just pop up out of nowhere. Did you need something? Like, why now?" "Wyatt Thomas Miller, that is enough," Thomas growled, his voice low and authoritative. But I didn't look away from Wyatt. I understood his anger. He was the son who had watched his mother carry a ghost her whole life, and now the ghost was sitting at his dinner table eating his dad's steak. He loved her, and he viewed me as a threat to her fragile peace. I set my fork down. I looked Wyatt dead in the eye. I didn't pop up out of nowhere because I wanted to, I said, my voice steady, carrying the cold weight of the last few months. I popped up because a month ago, I found out the people who raised me only did it to steal my inheritance. I found out they've been using me as a legal loophole for 25 years. I found out my entire life was a financial transaction. The table went dead silent. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Thomas stopped chewing. I'm not here for money, I continued, staring at my brother. I'm not here to take your mother away from you. I am here because I found out I was a prop in someone else's scam, and I just wanted to know if anyone in this world actually wanted me. Wyatt stared at me, the hostility draining from his face, replaced by a sudden, jarring shock. He looked at his mother, then back at me. He swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. They stole from you? Wyatt asked, his voice cracking slightly, dropping the tough guy act. Yes, I said. Thomas slowly set his knife down on his plate. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't gasp. He looked at me, his jaw tightening, the protective instinct of a father flaring to life in his eyes. What do you need us to do? Thomas asked. 6 words, simple, solid, and completely devoid of the performative nonsense Benedetto always employed. Over the next few hours, sitting around that scratched wooden table, I laid out everything. The trust fund, the ledger, the clause that activated on my 25th birthday. I told them how Sabella had been dropping hints about securing my financial independence, asking me to review some boring legal documents with her lawyer in the spring to help me transition to adulthood. She's going to bury the liability waiver in a stack of meaningless paperwork, I explained, tracing the rim of my water glass. She'll probably frame it as a lease agreement for the garage or a transfer of the car title. If I sign it, the trust is legally dissolved. The 25 years of fraud are erased. They get away with everything, and I am left with nothing. Wyatt was pacing the kitchen, running his hands through his hair, his earlier hostility entirely replaced by righteous fury. We go to the cops. We go right now. That's grand larceny. That's fraud. I can't, I said. I spoke to a lawyer in the city, Sarah Jenkins. She looked at the copies I took. I pulled the business card from my pocket. Sarah had been incredibly blunt. Isabeau, until you turn 25, they are the legal custodians. The withdrawals are highly suspicious, but Sabella can argue she used the money to maintain a household that benefited you. To prove criminal fraud, we need to catch them attempting to force the waiver under false pretenses upon the trust's maturity. You have to wait until they hand you the pen. If I spook them now, I told my new family, Sabella will destroy the original documents. She'll drain whatever is left, move it offshore, and claim it was lost in bad investments. I have to wait. I have to let her think she's won. Clara reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was warm. You've been carrying this all by yourself, living right in their backyard. I have 5 months left, I said, and I am terrified. And it was Thomas who moved then. He pushed back his chair, walked over to the mudroom, and pulled a heavy brass key off a hook on the wall. He walked back and set it on the table in front of me. This is the key to our front door, Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. If she looks at you wrong, if you feel unsafe, you get in your car and you drive here, day or night. You have a room here. Do you understand me? I looked at the key. In 25 years, Benedetto had never once made me feel safe. He had watched Sabella berate me, charge me rent I couldn't afford, and lock me out of the main house. And here was a man who had known me for 4 hours, offering me absolute sanctuary without hesitation. I nodded, the tears finally breaking through, hot and fast. Wyatt stopped pacing. He walked up behind my chair, hesitated for a second, and then awkwardly patted my shoulder. If you want, Wyatt muttered, looking at the ceiling to avoid eye contact, I can drive down there and slash their tires. Just say the word. I let out a wet, genuine laugh. Not yet, Wyatt, but keep the knife sharp. The drive back to my town that night felt different. The darkness wasn't as heavy. The cold didn't bite as deep. When I pulled into the driveway, the lights in the main house were blazing. Harper's expensive sports car, bought by Sabella, no doubt with my money, was parked in my usual spot. I had to park on the street and walk through the snow to the garage. As I passed the living room window, I saw Sabella and Benedetto sitting by the fireplace, drinking wine, laughing at something on the television. They looked like a magazine cover, the perfect, respectable, wealthy couple. I stood in the freezing snow and watched them. I didn't feel hurt anymore. The hurt was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating patience. Enjoy the wine, Sabella. Enjoy the warmth. Spring was coming, and with it, my 25th birthday. Spring arrived in our town not with a gentle thaw, but with a sudden, muddy violence. The snow melted rapidly, turning the pristine lawns of my parents' neighborhood into waterlogged bogs. The sky remained a relentless, bruised gray, and the damp cold seemed to seep right through the soles of my boots every time I crossed the yard to the main house. For most people, spring means rebirth. For me, it meant a ticking clock. I was officially in the countdown. My 25th birthday was looming on the horizon, a rapidly approaching deadline that dictated every breath I took. I was still living in the drafty garage apartment, paying my $400 a month and playing the role of the docile, endlessly grateful adopted daughter. But Sabella was getting restless. The closer we got to my birthday, the tighter she wound the leash. She could sense the shift in the air, even if she couldn't identify the source of it. Predators always know when the wind changes. It started on a dreary Tuesday evening in early April. I had just come home from a grueling 10-hour shift at the veterinary clinic. I was exhausted, my scrubs smelling faintly of wet dog and antiseptic. I trudged up the concrete driveway, looking forward to a hot shower and the silence of my tiny room. But Sabella was waiting for me. She was standing on the porch of the main house, wearing a cashmere cardigan draped over her shoulders, holding a crisp white envelope. She watched me approach with that predatory, closed-mouth smile she reserved for moments when she was about to exercise her power. "Isabeau, honey," she called out, her voice cutting through the damp evening air. "Come here for a moment, would you?" I forced my shoulders to relax. I pasted on a pleasant, subservient expression. "Hi, Mom. What's up?" She handed me the envelope. "I know you're tired, but Benedetto and I have been going over the household finances. With Harper moving into the spare room and the cost of everything going up, well, we've had to make some hard decisions." I looked down at the envelope. My name was written across the front in her perfect, aggressive cursive. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it was. "We've been subsidizing your living arrangement for 3 years," Sabella continued, her tone shifting into that practiced, rehearsed martyrdom. "We wanted to give you a soft place to land, but you're almost 25 now. You need to learn true financial responsibility. A real landlord wouldn't be this generous." I slid my thumb under the flap of the envelope and pulled out the single sheet of typed paper. Effective May 1st, rent for the detached garage unit will increase to $850 per month, plus a 40% share of all main property utilities. If these terms are unacceptable, a 30-day notice to vacate is required. She had more than doubled my rent. I did the math instantly in my head. $850 for a drafty garage, plus utilities, plus my car insurance, health insurance, and the student loans they had forced me to take out while they secretly drained my educational trust fund. It would leave me with barely $40 a week for groceries. She wasn't trying to teach me responsibility. She was trying to break my back. She wanted me completely, utterly broke and desperate right before my 25th birthday. She was setting the stage to swoop in as my savior, offering financial relief in exchange for my signature on the trust-dissolving documents. It was a classic extortion tactic, wrapped in a mother's loving concern. "I see," I said, keeping my voice incredibly level. I folded the paper and put it back in the envelope. "That's a big jump." Sabella tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly, searching my face for panic or tears. When she found neither, a flicker of irritation crossed her features. "It's market rate, Isabeau. Harper has been a wonderful help around the house, and we have to be fair to everyone. If you can't afford it, perhaps you need to ask Dr. Patel for a raise, or find a second job." "I'll make it work," I said smoothly. I looked her right in the eye. "Thank you for the notice. I appreciate you looking out for my financial maturity." I turned and walked away before she could reply. When I closed the door to the garage, my hands were shaking so hard I dropped my keys on the floor. I leaned against the cheap drywall and slid down until I was sitting on the cold linoleum, staring at the ceiling. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march back across the yard, kick the front door open, and throw the copies of the trust fund ledger right in her face. But Sarah Jenkins, the lawyer in the city, had been very clear. You have to wait until she hands you the pen. If you show your hand now, the money disappears and they walk away clean. So I survived. I started eating ramen noodles. I picked up extra weekend shifts cleaning kennels. I stopped buying coffee. And every Sunday, I drove 2.5 hours north to Ridgemont, to the small, cluttered farmhouse where my real family lived. The Miller house had become my sanctuary. It was the only place in the world where I didn't have to perform, but building a relationship with a family you've never known isn't a fairy tale. It's hard, messy work. Clara, my biological mother, was still navigating a minefield of guilt. She apologized constantly for missing my first steps, for missing my high school graduation, for the weather. Thomas, my father, was a man of few words, showing his affection by quietly changing the oil in my car or making sure my favorite brand of orange juice was in the fridge. And then there was Wyatt. My 20-year-old brother was fiercely protective of Clara and inherently suspicious of everything else. We circled each other for weeks, two strangers tied together by blood and trauma, unsure of how to bridge the gap. The ice broke on a rainy Saturday in late April. I had driven up to Ridgemont straight from a brutal shift. Sabella had called me twice on the drive, leaving voicemails reminding me that my new doubled rent was due on the 1st, and asking if I needed a small temporary loan from her to cover it. The psychological warfare was exhausting. When I pulled into the Miller's gravel driveway, I didn't get out of the car. I just sat behind the steering wheel, the engine turned off, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The exhaustion caught up to me all at once, the fear of the impending confrontation. The sheer, suffocating weight of holding a secret that was going to destroy the only family I had ever known. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, and for the first time in months, I broke down. I sobbed until I couldn't catch my breath, my shoulders shaking violently. A sharp tap on the glass made me jump. Wyatt was standing in the pouring rain, wearing a faded hoodie, staring at me through the driver's side window. I hurriedly wiped my face, unlocked the doors, and rolled down the window. "Hey," I croaked, trying to sound casual. "Give me a second, I'm just gathering my stuff." Wyatt didn't say anything. He just opened the passenger door, slid into the seat, and slammed it shut, dripping rainwater all over the upholstery. He stared straight ahead at the windshield wipers. "You look like hell," he muttered. "Thanks. Nice to see you too," I snapped, defensive and embarrassed. "Did she call you again?" Wyatt asked, his jaw tightening. "The Wicked Witch of the South?" "She doubled my rent," I whispered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "She's trying to starve me out before my birthday, so I have to beg her for help. It's working, Wyatt. I have $42 in my checking account." Wyatt turned to look at me, his dark eyes flashing with a sudden, volatile anger. "That's it. Give me the keys." "What?" "Give me the keys to your car," he demanded, holding out his hand. "I'm driving down there. I'm going to throw a brick through her pristine living room window, and then I'm going to pack your stuff and move you up here. You are done living in a garage." "Wyatt, stop," I said, putting my hand over the ignition. "You can't do that." "Watch me," he growled. "You're my sister. You don't have to sit there and let those psychopaths torture you. I'm not going to let them." The word hung in the air. Sister. He had never called me that before. He had always called me Isabeau, or referred to me carefully as Clara's daughter. "I have to let them," I said, my voice shaking. "If you throw a brick through her window, Sabella will call the cops. She plays the victim better than anyone on earth. She'll get a restraining order, she'll realize I've been talking to you, and she will quietly dissolve the trust fund before I ever see a dime. 25 years of fraud, Wyatt. 25 years of her using me to get rich. I am not letting her walk away from that." "So you just suffer?" he yelled, hitting the dashboard with the heel of his hand. "You just sit there and eat ramen while she buys her niece sports cars?" "Yes," I yelled back, the frustration finally boiling over. "Yes, I suffer, because if I don't wait for her to hand me that legal waiver, I have no proof. I need her to try and trap me so I can trap her back. This isn't a movie, Wyatt. I can't just punch her in the face. I have to be smarter than her." We sat in silence, our breathing heavy, the rain drumming against the metal roof of the car. Wyatt ran his hands through his wet hair. The anger drained out of him, leaving behind a profound, frustrated sadness. He looked at me, really looked at me, seeing the dark circles under my eyes and the tension vibrating through my body. I hate that you have to go back there," he said quietly. "I know," I said, leaning my head against the cold glass of the window. "But I have a plan. I just need you guys to trust me." Wyatt reached across the center console and grabbed my shoulder, giving it a rough, firm squeeze. "All right, we play the long game, but the second you give the signal, I'm burning her social life to the ground." I let out a wet, exhausted laugh. "Deal!" When we finally walked into the house, dripping wet, Thomas was waiting in the hallway. He didn't ask why my eyes were red or why Wyatt looked like he was ready to go to war. He just pointed a greasy finger toward the living room. "Go look in the corner," Thomas said in his low rumble. I walked into the living room. Sitting against the far wall, smelling of fresh pine and wood stain, was a beautiful, handcrafted oak bookshelf. It was sturdy, elegant, and built with absolute precision. Mom said you mentioned all your vet textbooks were sitting in cardboard boxes on the floor of your garage because they were too heavy for the cheap particle board shelves you had, Wyatt said from behind me, stripping off his wet hoodie. Dad's been in the shed every night this week building that. I turned to look at Thomas. The big, quiet mechanic was wiping his hands on a rag, looking everywhere but at me, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude. It's solid, Thomas muttered, examining a spot on the wall. It'll hold whatever weight you put on it. Just thought you should have somewhere decent to put your things when you get your own place. A real place. In 25 years, Benedetto had never built me anything. He had never even hung a picture frame for me without sighing heavily and complaining about his back. And here was this man, my real father, spending his evenings covered in sawdust just so my books wouldn't have to sit on a cold floor. Thank you, I choked out, covering my mouth. It's beautiful. It'll hold, Thomas repeated softly. And I knew he wasn't just talking about the wood. He was talking about them. They would hold my weight. 2 weeks later, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I had scheduled a secret meeting with Sarah Jenkins, the financial fraud attorney Chloe had recommended. I took a sick day from the clinic, drove 2 hours in the opposite direction of Ridgemont, and parked 3 blocks away from her high-rise office building, paranoid that Cybella somehow had a private investigator tailing me. Sarah's office was intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows, dark mahogany wood, and the distinct humming silence of serious money. Sarah herself was a shark wrapped in a tailored silk suit. She didn't do small talk. She dealt in facts, leverage, and legal destruction. We sat across from each other, the copies of the Hayes Family Revocable Living Trust spread out on the massive glass desk between us. You're turning 25 in 4 weeks, Sarah said, tapping a silver pen against the ledger. Cybella has increased your financial strain to maximum capacity. You are officially desperate. Now comes the hook. How is she going to do it? I asked, my palms sweating against the leather chair. How is she going to get me to sign away my rights to a trust fund I don't know exists? Sarah pulled a blank sheet of legal paper toward her. Cybella cannot simply hand you a document that says, I waive my rights to the Hayes Trust. You would read that, realize what it meant, and the jig would be up. She has to camouflage the liability waiver inside a completely different, seemingly benevolent transaction. A Trojan horse, I murmured. Exactly, Sarah said, her eyes sharp. In my experience with custodial fraud of this magnitude, the trustee will use a promissory note or a deed of transfer. Think about your life, Isabeau. What leverage does she hold over you right now? What is something you need that she legally owns? I thought about it. The garage apartment? No, she was using that to bleed me dry. My car, I said slowly. It's a 10-year-old sedan. Benedetto bought it used when I was 17, but the title is still in his name. I pay the insurance, but legally they own it. Cybella has threatened to take it back a few times when I disrespected her. Sarah nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. Perfect, the car. And you just told me she doubled your rent, creating an artificial debt. She's manufacturing a financial crisis so she can rescue you from it. Here is exactly what is going to happen on or near your birthday. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a clinical, precise cadence. Cybella will sit you down, likely in a public setting, to prevent you from making a scene or reacting emotionally. She will play the exhausted, benevolent mother. She will say something like, Isabeau, you are 25 now. It is time for you to be fully independent. We are going to transfer the title of the car into your name, and we are going to forgive the back rent you owe us to give you a fresh start. My stomach churned. It sounded exactly like something Cybella would say. But, Sarah continued, raising a finger, she will say that because of tax purposes or legal formalities, she needs you to sign a standard release document, a contract acknowledging the transfer of the vehicle and the settlement of your debts to them. It will be a thick packet, lots of boilerplate legal jargon. She will rush you. She will tell you to just sign the back page so you can celebrate. As Sarah tapped the pen hard against the glass desk, buried in paragraph 12, or clause section D of that vehicle transfer agreement, will be a single sentence. It will state, the undersigned hereby releases Benedetto and Cybella Hayes from any and all past, present, and future fiduciary responsibilities, custodial obligations, and financial liabilities, effectively discharging any custodial trusts or accounts. I stared at Sarah, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. If you sign that, Sarah said, her voice devoid of pity. The trust is legally dead. The 25 years of fraud are washed clean. They walk away with millions, and you walk away with a 10-year-old used car and a garage apartment you can't afford. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it made me dizzy. Sabella was going to steal my inheritance, and she was going to make me thank her for it. She was going to weaponize my gratitude to secure her theft. So what do I do? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You let her set the trap, Sarah said, leaning back in her chair. You go to the dinner. You let her present the documents, but you do not sign them. You take possession of that contract. The moment she hands you that poison promissory note, she has committed attempted fraud in writing. That piece of paper is the smoking gun we need to freeze their assets and file criminal charges. Sarah looked at me, her gaze piercing right through my anxiety. She is going to try and shame you into signing it. She will call you ungrateful. She will threaten to kick you out. She will use every psychological weapon she has built over 25 years. You have to be made of stone, Isabeau. Can you do that? I thought of the cold basement floor. I thought of the $5,400 tax receipt. I thought of my real mother, Clara, weeping in the vet clinic. I thought of Thomas building me a bookshelf, and Wyatt offering to throw a brick for me. I can be made of stone, I said. I left the city and drove back to the small town that had been my prison. When I pulled into the driveway, Harper was sitting on the front porch filing her nails. She looked up and offered me a condescending smirk. Aunt Sabella is looking for you, she drawled. She's in the kitchen. She said it's important. I didn't acknowledge Harper. I walked past her, pushed open the heavy oak door of the main house, and stepped into the immaculate, marble-countered kitchen. The kitchen my money had paid for. Sabella was standing by the island, pouring a glass of expensive Pinot Noir. She looked up, her face arranging itself into a mask of maternal sweetness that made my skin crawl. There you are, Isabeau, she said, taking a sip of the wine. Benedetto and I were just talking about your birthday next week. 25. It's a milestone. It is, I said neutrally. We want to take you out to celebrate, Sabella said, her eyes glittering with a dark, hidden anticipation. Maggie's place. Friday night, just the three of us. Dressed nicely. We have some important adult matters to discuss. Some paperwork to help you finally become fully independent. The trap was set. The jaws were open. I looked at the woman who had stolen my life, who had treated me like a tax write-off and a walking ATM. I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that didn't reach my eyes. I love that, Mom, I said. I can't wait. The last 2 weeks before my 25th birthday felt like holding my breath underwater while watching the surface slowly turn to ice. Sabella's behavior shifted dramatically. The aggressive, demanding landlord who had just doubled my rent vanished, replaced overnight by a sickly sweet caricature of a doting mother. It was a terrifying transformation, mostly because I finally understood the mechanics behind it. She believed she had successfully backed me into a financial corner. She thought I was starving, desperate, and completely broken. Now, it was time for her to play the savior. She started bringing me leftovers from the main house, small, calculated offerings wrapped in aluminum foil, a slice of meatloaf, half a piece of lemon meringue pie. She would stand in the doorway of my freezing garage apartment, her cashmere sweaters looking absurdly out of place against the water-stained drywall, and sigh with exaggerated maternal concern. You look so thin, Isabeau, she cooed one evening, setting a Tupperware container on my cheap folding table. Are you getting enough to eat? You know, once we get past this little rough patch with the rent, things will be much easier for you. We just want you to be independent, sweetheart. Benedetto and I have a wonderful surprise for you at dinner on Friday to help you get on your feet. I looked at the Tupperware. I looked at her perfectly painted lips, curled into that serene, predatory smile. Thank you, Mom, I said, forcing my voice to sound small and defeated. I'm really looking forward to it. I've been so stressed about money lately. Sabella's eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. She reached out and patted my cheek, a gesture so devoid of actual warmth it made my skin crawl. I know, darling, but trust us. After Friday, all your financial worries will be a thing of the past. She was right about one thing. After Friday, everything was going to change, just not in the way she intended. As soon as you walked back across the lawn, the facade dropped. I dumped the meatloaf into the trash. I didn't want anything she had touched. I pulled out my phone and dialed Chloe. It's time, I told my best friend. Bring the boxes. For the next 10 nights, under the cover of darkness, I systematically erased my existence from the Hayes property. Chloe would pull her old SUV into the alley behind the garage around midnight. We packed my clothes, my vet textbooks, the few keepsakes that actually meant something to me, and smuggled them out like contraband. I left the garage looking exactly as it always had on the surface. The bed was made. A few cheap pots sat on the stove, a couple of old sweaters hung in the closet, but the drawers were empty. The life was gone. I was just a ghost haunting a shell, waiting for the exorcism. The weekend before the dinner, I drove north to Ridgemont for a final war council with my real family. The atmosphere in the Miller house was thick with nervous energy. We sat around the scarred wooden kitchen table, a hand-drawn map of Maggie's place spread out between us. Wyatt had insisted I draw the layout of the restaurant so he knew exactly where the exits and the sightlines were. "Okay, look," I said, tapping a pen against the paper. "Maggie's place is the only sit-down restaurant in our town. On a Friday night, it will be packed. Half the church congregation goes there after choir practice. The mayor eats there. Sabella specifically chose it because it's a theater. She wants an audience, so I can't cause a scene when she hands me the paperwork." "She's using public pressure to force your hand," Thomas rumbled, his thick arms crossed over his flannel shirt. He was staring at the map with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. Smart, but arrogant. "Exactly," I nodded. "She thinks I'll be too embarrassed to read the fine print or ask questions in front of Pastor James and the neighborhood gossips. She expects me to just sign the back page, smile, and thank her for giving me a 10-year-old car." Clara was sitting next to me, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of herbal tea. She looked pale. The prospect of coming face to face with the woman who had essentially purchased her child 25 years ago was weighing heavily on her. "Clara," I said softly, abandoning the map and turning to her, "you don't have to do this. You don't have to be there. I can handle Sabella." "No," Clara said, her voice trembling, but her chin lifting with sudden defiance. She looked me in the eye, and for the first time, I saw the fierce, unyielding strength that had allowed her to survive the last 2 decades. "I let them intimidate me when I was 17. I let them lock me in a room and tell me I was worthless. I am not letting that woman sit across from my daughter and steal from her again. I will be there." Wyatt reached over and grabbed his mother's hand, a fierce, proud grin breaking across his face. "That's right. We're rolling deep." "You need to book a table under a different name," I instructed, looking at Wyatt. "Book it for 6:30 p.m. Sabella's reservation is at 7. Make sure you request a booth in the back section near the swinging doors to the kitchen. It's slightly elevated. You'll be able to see our table, but Sabella won't notice you unless she turns completely around." "Got it," Wyatt said, typing furiously into his phone. "Reservation for 3 under the name Miller. Wait, no. She might recognize the name from the DNA site if she ever bothered to look. Let's go with Smith." "Don't come over to the table," I warned them, the gravity of the situation settling over the room. "No matter what she says, no matter how nasty she gets, you have to wait for my signal. Sarah Jenkins was very clear. I need Sabella to physically hand me the promissory note and verbally confirm that my signature is required for her gift. The second she does that, the trap is sprung. Then, and only then, you walk over." Thomas leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. He looked at me with those deep, steady eyes. "Isabeau," Thomas said quietly, "are you sure you want to do it this way? We could just hire Sarah to file the injunction on Monday morning. You don't have to put yourself through a public execution." I thought about the 25 years of subtle psychological torture. I thought about the thousands of times Sabella had made me feel like an ungrateful burden while she secretly wore clothes and drove cars paid for by my inheritance. I thought about Benedetto looking at his shoes while she tore my self-esteem to shreds. Filing an injunction quietly in a courtroom wouldn't hurt Sabella. She would hire expensive lawyers, spin a story about a misunderstanding, and play the victim to her country club friends. She would claim I was a greedy, confused child. "I'm sure," I told Thomas, my voice turning to steel, "if I do this quietly, she keeps her reputation. Her reputation is the only thing she actually loves. I'm going to take it from her, in front of everyone." The final few days dragged by with agonizing slowness. Wednesday bled into Thursday. The weather broke, the relentless spring rain giving way to a thick, suffocating fog that rolled through the streets of our small town, making everything look like a ghost story. It was Thursday night, the eve of my 25th birthday. I was sitting in the middle of the empty garage apartment. Everything I owned was gone. save for the clothes on my back, my toothbrush, and the thick manila envelope resting on the cheap folding table. Inside the envelope were 3 things: the printed ancestry, DNA results confirming Clara as my mother, the highlighted tax receipt from the year of my adoption, and the complete 20-page ledger of the Hayes Family Revocable Living Trust. The trap was fully armed. It was 11:30 p.m. The fog outside was so thick I could barely see the glowing yellow porch light of the main house. I was just about to turn off the single, buzzing overhead lamp and try to sleep when a heavy knock rattled the thin wood of my door. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sabella never came to the garage this late. She valued her beauty sleep too much. The knock came again, softer this time, more hesitant. I walked over, the floorboards creaking beneath my socks, and slid the deadbolt back. I opened the door a few inches. Standing in the freezing fog, illuminated by the harsh glare of the motion sensor light, was my adoptive father, Benedetto. He looked terrible. He was wearing an expensive silk bathrobe over his slacks, his hair uncombed. He was shivering, though whether from the cold or from nerves, I couldn't tell. A sharp, unmistakable scent of expensive scotch rolled off him in waves. "Dad?" I said, keeping the door partially blocking my body. "What's wrong? Is someone hurt?" He didn't look at my face. He looked at the doorframe, then at the dead rose bushes, then down at his leather slippers. He was clutching a silver flask in his right hand, his knuckles white. "Can I come in for a second, Isabeau?" His voice was thick, slurred at the edges. I hesitated. I didn't want him in here. I didn't want him to notice that the bookshelf was gone or that my closet was completely empty, but I stepped back and opened the door. He walked in, bringing the smell of alcohol and wet fog with him. He stopped in the center of the room, looking around. He seemed confused by the stark emptiness, but the bourbon in his system kept him from processing it fully. "You're turning 25 tomorrow," Benedetto muttered, swaying slightly on his feet. "I am," I said, standing by the open door, letting the cold air rush in. I wanted him to leave. Benedetto unscrewed the cap of the flask, took a long pull, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach turn. It was guilt. Sick, rotting, decades-old guilt. "Your mother, Sabella," he started, his voice cracking. He looked away again. "She's going to give you some papers tomorrow night at the restaurant." Every muscle in my body went rigid. Had she found out? Did they know about Sarah Jenkins? Did they know about Clara? "What kind of papers?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain perfectly flat. Benedetto let out a pathetic, breathy laugh that sounded more like a sob. "A car title and a release form. She's going to tell you it's standard procedure for transferring the asset. She's going to tell you it clears the back rent you owe us." He knew. Of course he knew. He had signed off on every single fraudulent withdrawal alongside her for 25 years. "Okay," I said, my heart pounding in my ears. "And?" Benedetto took a step toward me. His eyes were watering. He looked like a small, frightened boy trapped in the body of an aging, wealthy man. "Don't sign it, Isabeau." The silence in the garage was absolute. Even the buzzing of the overhead light seemed to stop. "What do you mean, don't sign it?" I asked softly. "Just tell her you need to read it over. Take the papers, put them in your purse, and walk out. Leave town, Isabeau. Go somewhere she can't find you. Don't sign that paper." I stared at the man who had raised me, the man who had walked me to my first day of kindergarten, the man who had bandaged my scraped knees. He was standing in my freezing apartment, reeking of liquor, trying to absolve his conscience at the 11th hour with a vague, cowardly warning. He wasn't trying to save me. He was trying to save himself from the guilt of watching the axe fall. A cold, terrifying calm washed over me. The last shred of familial affection I held for Benedetto Hayes withered and died right there on the linoleum floor. "Why shouldn't I sign it, Benedetto?" I asked, dropping the title of Dad. He flinched at the use of his first name. Because it's not what she says it is. It's a trap. It's always a trap with her." "A trap for what?" I pushed, stepping closer to him, refusing to let him look away. "What is she hiding in those papers?" "I can't say," he whimpered, actually stepping back from me. "If she knows I told you, she'll destroy me. You don't know what it's like to live with her, Isabeau. You don't know the things she's capable of, the manipulation, the cruelty." "I don't know what it's like," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I have lived in a garage for 3 years while she bought a new Lexus. I have scrubbed kennels to pay for textbooks while she demanded rent I couldn't afford. I know exactly what she is capable of." I looked at him, feeling nothing but profound disgust. "You knew," I stated, the realization solidifying into undeniable fact. "You knew what she was doing. You knew why she adopted me. You knew about the money." Benedetto squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear escaped, cutting a track through the wrinkles on his cheek. "It was my parents' money. It was supposed to be mine. But they hated her. They locked it away from us. When we found the loophole, the adoption, it was supposed to just be a way to get what was rightfully ours." "By buying a human being," I said, the words tasting like copper. "She promised she would love you," Benedetto sobbed, breaking down completely. He fell to his knees on the cheap floor, clutching the silver flask to his chest. "She promised we would be a real family once the money was secured. But she never loved you, Isabeau. She hated you. She hated that you were smart. She hated that you didn't need her. She just saw you as a combination lock to a bank vault. I tried to stop her. I tried to tell her to leave some for you, but she wouldn't listen." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man on my floor. This was twist number 3. The twist wasn't that they were stealing from me. I already knew that. The twist was that Benedetto wasn't just a victim of Sibella's manipulation, as I had always tried to convince myself. He was an active, conscious participant who traded a child's entire future for a quiet life and a remodeled kitchen. He was worse than Sibella. Sibella was a predator. It was in her nature. Benedetto was a coward who watched the predator eat his child and complained about the mess. "Get up," I said. My voice was completely devoid of emotion. Benedetto sniffled, looking up at me with red, bleary eyes. "Isabeau, please, just pack your things tonight. I'll give you cash. I have a few thousand in a private account she doesn't know about. Just take it and run. Don't go to the dinner." "Get up," I repeated, louder this time. He scrambled to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall for balance. "I am going to the dinner tomorrow night," I told him, looking him dead in the eye. "And I am going to sit across from my mother, and whatever she hands me, I will take." "She'll ruin you," he whispered, horrified. "No, Benedetto," I said, opening the door and gesturing out into the freezing fog. "She won't. Because leverage only works when the victim is blind, and I haven't been blind for 8 months. Benedetto stared at me, his alcohol-addled brain trying to process my words. He looked at my face, searching for the terrified, compliant girl he had known for 25 years. But she wasn't there anymore. He stumbled out the door, clutching his flask, and disappeared into the fog toward the main house. I locked the door behind him. I walked over to the table, picked up the thick manila envelope, and slid it into my oversized leather purse. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a hard wooden chair in the center of the empty room, watching the window as the sky slowly turned from pitch black to the bruised purple of dawn. Friday morning arrived, my 25th birthday. I worked my shift at the clinic with mechanical precision. Chloe kept giving me worried glances across the exam tables, but I just nodded at her. I was locked in. I was in the zone. At 5 o'clock, I went back to the garage to get ready. Sibella had told me to dress nicely. I put on a tailored black dress I had bought at a thrift store years ago. It was simple, armor-like. I pulled my dark hair back into a tight, severe bun. I applied red lipstick, a color Sibella had always told me made me look cheap, but which I knew made me look exactly like Clara Miller. At 6:45 p.m., I picked up my leather purse. The manila envelope was heavy inside, pressing against my ribs like a loaded weapon. I walked out of the garage, didn't look back at the main house, and got into my car. The drive to Maggie's place took 10 minutes. The parking lot was completely packed, cars spilling over onto the grass shoulder of the highway. Friday night in a small town, everyone was here. I killed the engine. I sat in the darkness of my car for 1 full minute. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the cold air, and centered myself. I wasn't the scared girl in the basement anymore. I wasn't the tax write-off. I wasn't the combination lock to the Hayes Family Trust. I was Isabeau Miller, and I was about to burn an empire to the ground. I opened the car door and walked toward the glowing neon sign of the restaurant. The heavy wooden door of Maggie's place swung open, and a wall of warm air, smelling of fried chicken, cedar wood, and spilled beer, hit me in the face. The restaurant was deafeningly loud. It was 7 p.m. on a Friday. In a town of 4,000 people, Maggie's place wasn't just a diner, it was the social epicenter. It was where reputations were polished, gossip was traded, and judgments were silently passed over plates of mashed potatoes. I stood in the entryway, letting my eyes adjust to the dim, amber lighting. I scanned the room. 2 tables to my left, Reverend James was sitting with his wife and 3 other prominent members of the church committee. A little further back, near the bar, was the high school principal and his family. The room was packed with people who had spent the last 2 decades treating Cybella Hayes like a living saint. I looked toward the back of the restaurant, past the bustling waitresses and the swinging doors of the kitchen. There, in a dimly lit corner booth, I saw a flash of red flannel. It was Wyatt. He was sitting on the outside edge of the booth, his broad shoulders tense, a glass of water untouched in front of him. Next to him, partially obscured by the shadows, was Clara. Thomas sat across from them, his massive frame dwarfing the small wooden table. Wyatt caught my eye. He didn't smile. He just gave me a single, barely perceptible nod. We are here. We hold the line. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my black dress, and turned my attention to the center of the room. Cybella and Benedetto were seated at a prime table right in the middle of the floor, highly visible from every angle. Cybella was wearing a crimson silk blouse, a power color. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She looked like a woman preparing to accept an award. Across from her, Benedetto looked like a man walking to the gallows. He was wearing a stiff button-down shirt, but his face was ashen, slick with a fine sheen of cold sweat. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the salt shaker. I walked over. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, the sound steady and rhythmic. "Isabeau! Darling, happy birthday!" Cybella chimed, her voice pitched artificially high so the neighboring tables could hear. She stood up and leaned across the table to air-kiss my cheek, leaving a faint scent of expensive jasmine perfume in her wake. "Look at you." 25. A full-grown woman. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad," I said, sliding into the chair opposite them. I set my oversized leather purse on the empty chair beside me, keeping it within arm's reach. Benedetto finally looked up. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, filled with a desperate, pathetic pleading before he quickly looked down at his water glass. He had tried to warn me. He had failed. Now he was just waiting for the explosion. Maggie herself, the silver-haired, no-nonsense owner of the restaurant, came over to our table with a pot of coffee and a warm smile. "Happy birthday, Isabeau. Hard to believe you're 25. I remember when your folks first brought you in here, little thing wrapped in a pink blanket." "Thank you, Maggie." I smiled genuinely. "We are just so blessed," Cybella sighed, placing a hand over her heart and looking at Maggie. "Raising her has been the greatest joy of our lives. Even with all the sacrifices, it was worth every penny." Maggie nodded politely, poured the coffee, and bustled away. The moment she was gone, Cybella's warm maternal expression hardened into something sharp and businesslike. She didn't want to waste time. The trap was heavily baited, and she was eager to snap it shut. We ordered our food. We made excruciating small talk about the weather, about the clinic, about Harper's new job prospects. I ate my salad slowly, chewing every bite, letting the tension stretch. I was completely, terrifyingly calm. I was made of stone. When the main courses were cleared away, Cybella dabbed her mouth with her napkin and folded her hands neatly on the table. "Isabeau," she began, her tone shifting into that practiced, benevolent cadence. "Your father and I have been talking a lot lately. You are 25 now. It's a milestone, and we feel it is finally time for you to spread your wings." "Spread my wings?" I repeated, keeping my face perfectly blank. "Yes," Cybella smiled, reaching into her designer handbag. "We know the rent increase on the garage has been stressful for you. We know you've been struggling, and as your parents, it breaks our hearts to see you worry about money." She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and placed it on the table between us. It looked incredibly official. "So we decided to give you a fresh start," Cybella announced. Her voice was carrying. I could see Reverend James's wife slightly turn her head to listen in. Cybella loved an audience for her charity. "Inside this envelope," Cybella continued, "is the title to your car. We are legally transferring ownership to you, free and clear. Furthermore, we are completely forgiving the back rent you owe us, and you can stay in the garage rent-free for the next 3 months while you save up for your own place." She pushed the envelope toward me. "We want you to be independent, sweetheart. We want you to be free." I looked at the envelope. I didn't reach for it. "That is incredibly generous, Mom. Thank you." Cybella's smile widened, exposing her teeth. "You're welcome, darling. Now, because this involves the transfer of a major asset and the forgiveness of a financial debt, our accountant drew up a standard release form. It just makes everything legal and protects all of us from any future tax liabilities. It's mostly boring boilerplate." She reached into her bag again and pulled out a stapled packet of legal documents about 10 pages thick. She set it next to the envelope and placed a sleek silver pen on top of it. I marked the signature line on the last page with a sticky note, Cybella said smoothly, tapping the pen. Just sign right there, and the car is yours. Happy birthday. I stared at the silver pen. This was it. The moment of truth. 25 years of psychological abuse, 25 years of theft, all culminating in this single, seemingly innocent piece of paper. I picked up the packet. I didn't flip to the back page. I opened it to the first page and started reading. Cybella shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Isabeau, honey, you don't need to read the whole thing. It's just standard legal jargon. Your dinner is getting cold. I like to know what I'm signing, I said mildly, turning to page 2. Benedetto let out a shaky breath and took a massive gulp of his water. I scanned the paragraphs. Sarah Jenkins had trained me well. I ignored the fluff about the vehicle identification number and the clauses about property rental laws. I kept flipping. Page 3, page 4, and then I found it. Buried at the bottom of page 5, under a section deceptively titled General Liabilities and Estate Resolutions. Clause 5. D. The undersigned, Isabeau Hayes, upon reaching the age of majority and 25 years, hereby permanently and irrevocably releases Benedetto Hayes and Cybella Hayes from any and all past, present, and future fiduciary responsibilities, custodial obligations, and financial liabilities. The undersigned acknowledges the receipt of all due assets and agrees to fully discharge and dissolve any custodial trusts, accounts, or educational funds previously held in her name or for her benefit, waiving all rights to future legal or forensic audits of said accounts. There it was, the poison pill. If I signed my name at the back of this packet, the millions of dollars my grandparents had left for me would be legally wiped clean. Cybella and Benedetto would walk away with my inheritance, and I would walk away with a 10-year-old sedan and a profound sense of gratitude. I looked up from the paper. I looked directly into Cybella's eyes. Did you read this, Mom? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Of course I did, she said, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into place. Like I said, it's just standard tax protection. Now sign it so we can order dessert. I closed the packet. I picked up the silver pen, clicked it, and set it down on the table. Then I took the 10-page legal document, folded it neatly in half, and slid it directly into my oversized leather purse. I'm keeping this, I said. Cybella froze. The predatory smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. Excuse me? I'm keeping this contract, I repeated, my voice steady and clear. I'm not signing it tonight. I'm going to have my lawyer look it over on Monday morning. I just want to make sure I understand all the standard tax protection before I put my name on it. Benedetto dropped his fork. It hit his ceramic plate with a loud, sharp clack that echoed over the hum of the restaurant. Cybella's face drained of color and then immediately flushed with a dark, terrifying rage. The mask was slipping. The woman beneath the cashmere was clawing her way to the surface. Take that out of your bag, Cybella hissed, leaning across the table, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. No, I said simply. Isabeau, she warned, her eyes darting around to see if anyone was watching. Do not play games with me. That is my property. Give it back. If it's just a car title transfer, why do you care if my lawyer reads it? I asked, tilting my head. Because it is incredibly disrespectful, Cybella snapped, her volume rising. People at the adjacent tables were starting to look over. Reverend James paused with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth. After everything we have done for you, after we clothed you, fed you, and put a roof over your head, you sit here and treat us like criminals? I'm not treating you like a criminal, Cybella, I said, dropping the title of Mom for the first time in my life. It felt like breathing pure oxygen. I'm treating you like a custodial trustee. Cybella physically recoiled, as if I had slapped her across the face. She stared at me, her chest heaving. She knew the game was up. She looked at Benedetto for help, but he had buried his face in his hands, completely broken. When a narcissist loses control, they don't retreat. They attack. They try to burn the earth around them to distract from their own exposure. Cybella stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The restaurant went completely, utterly silent. The country music playing through the speakers seemed to fade into the background. Every eye in Maggie's place was locked on our table. You ungrateful little brat, Cybella spat, her voice ringing out through the quiet room. She didn't care about the audience anymore. She only cared about destroying me. We should have left you where you were. We should have let you rot. Cybella, please, Benedetto begged, his voice muffled behind his hands. Stop. No, Cybella yelled, pointing a manicured finger at my face. This was twist number 4, the desperate smear campaign. You want to know the truth? You want to know why we brought you into this family? Because nobody else wanted you. Your real mother was a filthy, pathetic junkie who sold you to us so she could go get her next fix. She threw you away like garbage, and we picked you up. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Reverend James stood up from his booth, looking horrified. Maggie stopped dead in her tracks near the kitchen doors. Sabella stood there, chest heaving, her eyes wild with vindictive triumph. She thought she had dropped the ultimate bomb. She thought she had shamed me into submission by weaponizing the deepest wound an adopted child carries. I sat perfectly still. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I slowly unzipped the main compartment of my leather purse. I bypassed the folded legal document she had just given me. Instead, I reached in and pulled out my heavy manila envelope. I unwound the red string. You're right about one thing, Sabella, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the restaurant like a scalpel. You didn't adopt me out of love. I pulled out the first piece of paper and slapped it down on the center of the table. This is a tax receipt from 25 years ago, I announced, projecting my voice so the entire room could hear. A $5,400 adoption credit. That was your first payout. Sabella stared at the neon yellow highlighted paper, her jaw dropping. I pulled out the second stack of documents, the 20-page ledger. I slammed it down next to the receipt. And this, I continued, standing up slowly so I was eye level with her, is the ledger for the Hayes Family Revocable Living Trust. The trust set up by Benedito's parents. The trust that was strictly reserved for a legal grandchild. You couldn't have kids and you couldn't touch the money. So you went out and bought a human key. Benedito let out a loud, wretched sob. The whispering in the restaurant escalated into a shocked, chaotic murmur. Reverend James took a step toward our table, his face pale. For 25 years, I said, my voice echoing off the oak-paneled walls, you have illegally withdrawn millions of dollars from my educational and living trust to fund your country club memberships, your kitchen remodels, and Harper's sports cars. And tonight, right here at this table, you tried to trick me into signing a liability waiver to cover up your federal fraud before I turned 25. That's a lie, Sabella shrieked, her voice cracking in panic. She reached across the table, trying to grab the documents, but I pulled them back out of her reach. She's lying. She's a disturbed, ungrateful girl. She forged those. I didn't forge them, I said coldly, and I didn't forge the DNA test I took 2 months ago either. I placed the final piece of paper on the table, the Ancestry DNA match. You told everyone my biological mother was a junkie who didn't want me, I said, looking Sabella up and down with absolute disgust. But that was just another lie you told to make yourself look like a savior. I turned my head toward the back of the restaurant. I looked at the dimly lit booth near the kitchen doors. I gave the signal. The restaurant watched in breathless silence as 3 figures stood up from the shadows. Thomas Miller stepped out first, his massive frame imposing in his flannel shirt, his face set in a look of grim, protective fury. Wyatt stepped out next, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. And then came Clara. She walked slowly, but her back was perfectly straight. She wasn't the terrified 17-year-old girl who had been locked in a bedroom. She wasn't the grieving woman crying in the vet clinic. She was a mother who had found her child, and she was walking toward the woman who had stolen her. As they approached, the crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. Sabella watched them coming, her eyes darting frantically. She didn't recognize them at first. But as Clara stepped into the warm overhead light of our table, Sabella's breath hitched. She remembered the face, older now, but undeniable. Clara stopped 2 feet away from Sabella. Thomas stood solidly at her right shoulder. Wyatt flanked her left, glaring at Benedetto with absolute murder in his eyes. The contrast between the 2 families was stark and devastating. Sabella and Benedetto wrapped in expensive silk and cashmere, rotting from the inside out with greed and cowardice. And the Millers, flannel, denim, calloused hands, radiating an immovable, authentic strength. Sabella opened her mouth to speak, but Clara cut her off. I was 17 years old, Clara said. Her voice wasn't a yell. It was quiet, trembling with decades of suppressed agony, but it carried a weight that commanded the entire room. My parents locked me in a room, Clara continued, staring directly into Sabella's panicked eyes. They brought me paperwork while I was still bleeding from giving birth. They told me you were a good Christian family who would give my baby a life I never could. They told me I was doing the right thing. Clara took a step closer. Sabella actually shrank back. I have spent 25 years hating myself. Clara's voice cracked, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. believing I was unworthy of the daughter I brought into this world. And I come here to find out that you didn't love her. You didn't protect her. You locked her in a garage and you used her as a bank account. You don't know what you're talking about, Cybella cried, looking around the room, desperate for an ally. She locked eyes with the pastor. James, please, tell these people. Tell them who I am. I am on the parish council. Reverend James looked at Cybella. He looked at the trust fund documents scattered on the table. He looked at the weeping, broken man sitting across from her. And he looked at Clara, whose pain was so raw and genuine it made the air heavy. I think, Reverend James said, his voice heavy with profound disappointment, we are finally seeing exactly who you are, Cybella. He turned his back on her and walked away. It was the final, fatal blow. In a small town, when the pastor turns his back on you, the community follows. Cybella looked around the restaurant. The people she had spent decades trying to impress, the PTA members, the neighbors, the high school principal, they were all staring at her with unabashed horror and disgust. The perfect, immaculate facade she had spent her life building had just been detonated in public, and there was nowhere to hide from the fallout. Benedetto, Cybella gasped, turning to her husband. Her voice was suddenly small, terrified. Benedetto, do something. Tell them. Benedetto slowly lowered his hands from his face. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been carrying a corpse on his back for 25 years and had finally dropped it. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at me. I'm sorry, Isabeau, Benedetto whispered. Then he stood up, grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, and walked away. He didn't wait for Cybella. He didn't defend her. He walked through the silent crowd, pushed open the heavy wooden door of Maggie's place, and disappeared into the freezing fog, leaving her completely and utterly alone. Cybella stood alone at the table, her hands trembling, her chest heaving. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Clara. She looked at me. There was no more maneuvering. There were no more lies to spin. The liability waiver was in my purse, a physical piece of evidence of attempted fraud. The ledger was exposed. Her husband was gone. Her reputation was ash. I calmly reached down and gathered my documents, sliding the DNA test, the tax receipt, and the ledger back into my manila envelope. I placed it in my purse next to the unsigned release form. I looked at Cybella Hayes one last time. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. I just felt a profound, incredible lightness. The chains were gone. Sarah Jenkins has a copy of everything, I told her quietly. Her office will be filing the injunction and contacting the authorities on Monday morning. I suggest you find a very good defense attorney. I turned away from her. I looked at Clara, Thomas, and Wyatt. Are you ready to go? Thomas asked, his voice gentle. Yeah, I said, a real, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. I'm ready to go home. Wyatt put his hand on my shoulder. Clara linked her arm through mine. Together, the four of us walked through the silent, staring crowd of Maggie's place. We didn't look back as we pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the cold, clean night air. Behind us, in the center of the restaurant, Cybella Hayes was left standing alone in the ruins of her own making. I didn't go back to the garage apartment that night. When we walked out of Maggie's place into the freezing, fog-draped Friday night, Thomas gently took the keys to my 10-year-old sedan from my trembling hands. Wyatt drove my car while I sat in the heated passenger seat of Thomas's heavy-duty truck, leaning against Clara's shoulder the entire 2.5-hour drive north to Ridgemont. For the first time in 3 years, I slept in a room that was fully insulated. I slept under a heavy patchwork quilt that smelled like lavender, rather than the faint, metallic scent of exhaust fumes. I slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a soldier who finally knows the war is over. By Monday morning, the small town I left behind had completely devoured Cybella Hayes. In a town of 4,000 people, news doesn't just travel, it migrates. It moves from pew to pew at Sunday service, from cart to cart in the grocery store aisles, and across the polished counters of the local bank. Reverend James didn't mention Cybella by name during his Sunday sermon, but he didn't have to. He preached a message about the dangers of false idols, about the rot of greed disguised as charity, and about how the Lord sees what happens behind locked doors. By Tuesday, Cybella was quietly asked to step down from the Church Beautification Committee. By Wednesday, the women she used to hold court with at the post office suddenly found themselves deeply fascinated by their phones whenever she walked in. She had spent decades building a throne out of other people's perceived flaws, and now that throne had collapsed under the weight of her own federal fraud. But the social exile was just the beginning of her nightmare. At exactly 9 a.m. on Monday, Sarah Jenkins, my shark of a lawyer, filed an emergency injunction with the county court backed by the copies of the trust ledger, the $5,400 adoption tax receipt, and my DNA results. The judge froze every single asset tied to the Hayes family revocable living trust. Sabella's credit cards were declined at the luxury salon. Her access to the remaining millions was completely severed. Sarah brought in a forensic accountant who tore through 25 years of Sabella's creative bookkeeping. The IRS was notified of the fraudulent withdrawals. Sabella had tried to trap me with a single piece of paper, but Sarah Jenkins buried her under a mountain of them. And then came the final twist. The ultimate irony that proved karma doesn't just circle back. It comes back with a vengeance. Sabella had used her niece, Harper, as the excuse to force me into the freezing garage. She had used Harper's arrival to justify doubling my rent and squeezing the life out of me. But Harper didn't sign up to be a social pariah. Harper liked the country club, the nice dinners, and the prestige of the Hayes name. Once the town turned on Sabella, the prestige evaporated. 2 weeks after the disaster at Maggie's place, Harper packed her expensive bags, threw the keys on the marble kitchen counter, and moved to the city to live with a friend. She didn't even leave a note. And Benedetto, the man who had traded his conscience for a quiet life, finally realized the silence in that massive house wasn't peaceful. It was a tomb. The public humiliation at the restaurant had stripped away the last of his cowardly denial. 3 weeks after my birthday, Benedetto packed 2 suitcases, walked out the front door, and filed for divorce. He left Sabella completely alone in a house paid for by stolen money, surrounded by neighbors who despised her. As for the garage apartment, the drafty, miserable box where she had tried to break my spirit, it sat completely empty. The pipes froze and burst that winter because Sabella couldn't afford the maintenance bill. The drywall I used to stare at was ruined. The entire structure was left to rot, a perfect physical monument to her greed. She had destroyed her family to make room for absolutely nothing. Some things just sort themselves out. 1 year later, springtime. I'm standing on the back porch of the Miller farmhouse in Ridgemont. The sky is a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air smells of blooming lilac and the rich, smoky scent of barbecue. I am 26 years old today. There are no forced smiles. There are no passive-aggressive comments about my weight or my career. There is no audience to perform for. Thomas is standing by the grill, using a pair of metal tongs to flip a row of steaks. He's wearing a stained apron over his flannel, humming along to a classic rock song playing from a battered radio. He sees me looking, gives me a quiet nod, and taps the tongs against the grill. His version of a grand, affectionate speech. Clara is in the kitchen, laughing. A real, loud, uninhibited laugh that fills the whole house. Chloe drove up from the city this morning, and the two of them are currently arguing over the correct ratio of mayonnaise to mustard in the potato salad. Clara looks 10 years younger. The heavy, suffocating shadow of the 17-year-old girl she used to be has completely vanished. The screen door squeaks open, and Wyatt steps out onto the porch. He is carrying a cake. It is slightly lopsided, the chocolate frosting applied with heavy, uneven strokes. But written across the top in bright neon blue icing are 3 words: "Happy birthday, sister." "Don't judge the penmanship," Wyatt mutters, his ears turning slightly red as he sets the cake down on the wooden picnic table. The icing tube exploded on the first try. I had to scrape it off and start over. "It's the most beautiful cake I've ever seen, Wyatt," I say, and my voice cracks slightly because I mean it with every fiber of my being. Wyatt grins, slinging a heavy arm around my shoulders and pulling me into a rough, familiar hug. "Yeah, well, don't let it go to your head. I still get the biggest slice." The afternoon bleeds into evening. We eat until we can barely breathe. We drink cold beers on the porch, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the tall grass near the tree line. Chloe tells a hilarious, entirely inappropriate story about a golden retriever at her new clinic, making Thomas laugh so hard he spills his drink. It is ordinary, it is loud, it is completely, unapologetically real. As the sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of indigo, I excuse myself and walk into the house. I go to my bedroom, a room with sturdy, insulated walls filled with the beautiful oak bookshelves Thomas built for me. I walk over to my nightstand, open the drawer, and pull out a folded piece of paper. It is the 10-page legal packet, the promissory note and liability waiver that Sabella tried to force me to sign 1 year ago. Sarah Jenkins had kept the original for the civil lawsuit, which we won decisively, recovering the majority of my grandparents' trust fund. This was just a copy, a souvenir of the trap I didn't fall into. I carry the folded paper back out to the kitchen. Clara is standing by the sink, wiping down the counters. On the windowsill above the sink sits a single white taper candle in a simple glass holder. It isn't lit. For 25 years, on this exact day, Clara would light a candle on her windowsill to mourn the baby she thought she had lost forever. It had been a ritual of profound, agonizing grief. I walk over to the counter, pick up a book of matches, and strike one. The small flame flares to life, warm and bright. I hold the folded legal document over the sink. I touch the match to the corner of the thick paper. It catches quickly. The fire eats through the dense, manipulative legal jargon. It burns through the lies about tax protections and vehicle transfers. It burns through the clause that was designed to erase 25 years of theft. I drop the burning paper into the stainless steel sink, watching as it curls, blackens, and turns to fragile gray ash. Clara stops wiping the counter. She watches the paper burn, then looks up at me, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. "What was that?" she asks softly. "Just some old baggage," I say. I turn on the faucet, washing the ashes down the drain, leaving the sink perfectly clean. I pick up the book of matches again. I strike a second match, reach over to the windowsill, and light the white taper candle. The flame dances for a moment before holding steady, casting a warm, golden glow against the glass of the window. "You don't have to light that anymore, Isabeau," Clara whispers, reaching out to touch my arm. "You're here. The waiting is over." "I know," I say, turning to face my mother. "For 25 years, you lit a candle for grief. Tonight, I'm lighting it for freedom." I reach into my pocket and pull out a small, official envelope from the county courthouse. I had picked it up yesterday, but I saved it for today. I hand it to Clara. She opens it with trembling fingers. She reads the document, lets out a soft, choked gasp, and covers her mouth. It is the official, legal confirmation of my name change. I am no longer Isabeau Hayes, the adopted tax write-off. I am no longer the human loophole. I am Isabeau Miller. I am a daughter. I am a sister. I am financially independent, completely unburdened, and deeply, fiercely loved. I look out the kitchen window, past the steady flame of the candle, out into the backyard where Thomas and Wyatt are arguing good-naturedly over the last piece of steak, and Chloe is laughing at them. Sabella Hayes tried to bury me in the dark of a freezing basement, surrounded by the weight of her secrets. But she forgot one very important thing. Seeds grow in the dark, and when they finally break through the soil, there is nothing on earth that can stop them from reaching the sun. That's my story. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If you've ever had to walk away from toxic people who disguise their manipulation as love, I hope this gave you the courage to know you are not alone and you are not crazy. If you connected with this story and want to hear more about finding strength and reclaiming your life, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It helps the channel grow, and it means the world to me. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.